Hey, how's it going? So last Friday, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, the top law enforcement official of the United States, well, he announced that the United States was going to seize the Russian frozen assets that are in the United States and give them to Ukraine. They're going to take those assets that were frozen. They were frozen assets. The owners of those assets can't do anything with them. They can't sell them or move them out of the United States. No, they're frozen, right? Take those frozen assets, confiscate them, and then give them to the Zelensky regime, which, as we all know, is one of the most corrupt regimes on the planet, for crying out loud. I mean, it's absurd, right? And this received almost zero attention in the US mainstream media, or the Western mainstream media for that matter. I mean, zero. I Googled it a few times, not a peep. But the rest of the world noticed. Oh yeah, there was an editorial in the Global Times, the Chinese English language newspaper. It was a whole editorial about it. This is a huge thing. And it only hurts the United States and the West. And it is a catastrophe, actually, on a financial level, okay? And you who are listening to this video might say, well, yeah, what do I care? You know, they take the money from some Russian oligarchs and they give it to Zelensky. You know, money from one oligarch to another oligarch, who cares, right? It's not my problem. It is your problem, and it's an incredibly serious problem. And let me explain why. See, the United States, over the last couple of decades, has been doing something known as civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture is basically this. It started with this justifiable fight against drug dealers, which is perfectly fine. And what would happen was that if some policeman stopped a car that they suspected was going around with drugs or drug money, that the law enforcement official had the right to seize that money. Seize it. And then eventually the rule was modified so that they could seize it and use it themselves. And so what has happened because of civil asset forfeiture over the last couple of decades is that anybody who is stopped by the police in the United States and the policeman suspects that the driver is involved in something illegal, they can seize any money or any valuable that you are carrying. And they've done this quite a number of times. In fact, a lot of police departments in the United States, their budgets depend on civil asset forfeiture. They can't make their budget unless they seize enough money from some random person traveling around with $1,000 or $2,000 in their pocket for whatever justifiable reason. They can seize that money and keep it for themselves and use it as they see fit. A lot of people have been complaining bitterly about this, but of course it's like a low-level kind of thievery that's been going on in the United States for the last couple of decades, although it's, slowly been creeping up to the point where people who are suspected of doing, like having a meth lab in their home, they're getting their houses seized. Even though there's no evidence that they ever cooked meth in their home, they're getting it seized anyway on the suspicion that it was going to be used for illegal activities. So this thing that Merrick Garland is doing is kind of like the inevitable conclusion, the going pro, if you will, of civil asset forfeiture. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, the rest of the world, I mean, in the United States, in the West, they didn't pay any attention to this whatsoever, but in the rest of the world, they paid a lot of attention to this. Because people don't usually know this. Very few people actually know it, except the people who are involved in hiding assets, offshore. Do you know the #1 destination for hiding assets and monies and bank accounts offshore is? You might think it's the Cayman Islands, you might think it's the British Virgin Islands, or Panama, or the Isle of Man, perhaps. No. The #1 location to hide offshore accounts and offshore assets is the United States of America. And what people do usually is they set up a dummy LLC in Delaware, where Joe Biden is from, by the way. And they have this dummy LLC with nominee directors handling and holding on to the cash of some Chinese businessmen, some Saudi businessmen, all kinds of people. And it's not just like the billionaire oligarchs. It goes all the way down the income ladder. There are people that I know personally that have a couple of $100,000 in the United States in some LLC just for a rainy day, just in case, okay? It goes from the billions all the way to a couple of $100,000. And that's how a lot of people in the rest of the world park their money in the United States. And a lot of times this money, you know what it is used for? It's used to buy treasury bonds. Treasury bonds, which finances the deficit spending of the United States. Now, nobody really knows how much money is hidden in the United States from all these other countries around the world, China, Saudi Arabia, the typical, the usual suspects, right? Nobody quite knows how much it is, but reputable estimates put it at over $1 trillion, okay? It's a whole boatload of cash. Now, to go back to this issue of Merrick Garland seizing Russian assets, not freezing them anymore, no, seizing them and giving them to Ukraine for Ukraine's reconstruction, which is not going to happen, but that money's going to be, poof, gone among the greedy little hands of Zelensky and his little crew, right? But what does it matter? Well, because, you see, in the United States and Canada and Western Europe, there is a lot of money hidden from China and from Saudi Arabia and the usual suspects. Now, Merrick Garland basically said that, we don't like the Russians. The Russians bad. So we're going to take their money and give it to the Ukrainians. Now, of course, if I'm a Chinese businessman, if I've got, $4, $5, $6 million in some LLC in Delaware, and that $4 or $5 million represents maybe 30% of my net worth, am I going to be nervous? Hell yeah. Because everybody knows that a war is coming with China. And not just China, the other countries that are turning away from the United States, they're going to be wondering to themselves, what will happen to our money in the United States if the United States all of a sudden declares us, one of the naughty nations, right? Like they did with Russia. What if they seize our nationals' assets in the United States? And by the way, the similar thing is going on in Europe. The Europeans right now are hell-bent for leather on figuring out how they can take the frozen Russian assets and give it to Ukraine as well. See? So this is not limited to the United States or even North America. It's Western-wide. And the West is in deficit spending. They don't have enough money to pay for all their bills. Okay? And they depend, not wholly, but in part, on foreign investment, foreign monies in the United States, in Europe. And so if this happens to Russia, what do you think is going through the minds of people in the rest of the world insofar as their assets in the United States? They're thinking to themselves, if my country gets hit, I'm going to lose what's mine. I mean, if you notice in my discussion so far, I'm not even talking about the ethics of taking somebody's money just because they happen to be a national of one of the enemy countries of the United States, okay? I mean, forget about the ethics of it, because if you go into the ethics of it, you're just like, this is outrageous, egregious, this is evil, this is wrong. Because, like, for instance, some Russian tennis player, just to give a hypothetical example, who does very well for himself, and he has a bank account, in Florida, because he lives in Florida, because that's where he trains, right? And he's made a few bucks because, he's successful on the tennis circuit, but he happens to be Russian, and so his assets got frozen, and now his assets are going to be stolen from him. Is this fair? Of course not. Anybody who claims it's fair is off his rocker, or working with Merrick Garland and the thieves in the US Justice Department. Justice Department, what an irony. So you see how grossly unfair it is to the individual. Because you see, the Russian central bank has assets in Europe. The Russian central bank has assets in the United States, dollar-denominated assets. Okay, they're going to take the hit too. But, it's not just the central bank. If it were limited to the central bank, maybe you could somehow justify it as some sort of like, punishment to the Russian state for the invasion of Ukraine, maybe you could justify it. But if you're just talking about anybody from that country, just because they happen to be from that country, and that's grotesquely unfair. But see, nationals from the Middle East, from China, from Asia generally, Japan, all kinds of people, they're going to be thinking to themselves, well, if my government falls on the naughty list of the Americans, then me, as a Chinese citizen who has nothing to do with a conflict between China and the United States, perhaps might be even against it, right? Perhaps might not even be living in China anymore and living happily in the United States or Western Europe somewhere. Well, I'm going to get my assets stolen, because that's what we're talking about, theft. I'm going to get my assets stolen by the American government and given to some third party without any recourse to the law. Because to go back to the civil forfeiture discussion previously in this video, see, if you lose your money through civil asset forfeiture, you can't get it back, not as a practical matter. It would cost you more to do the whole judicial thing than to get it back. Because you're not being charged with a crime. In this weird legalistic, I don't know what you call it, in this weird legal labyrinth that they have created, in civil asset forfeiture, it's the cash or the asset that is the culprit. And it's somehow the money or the good that has been stolen by the law enforcement, it has to hire the lawyers to demonstrate that it's not illegally gotten. And you think that this is just absurd. It's the truth. If you're driving around in the United States with, say, $1,000 or maybe $2,000 because you're going to buy, I don't know, you're going to go buy somebody a scooter or buy somebody's boat or something like that, something trivial, and you'd reasonably want to go around with that cash in hand, and you get stopped and you lose that money, there is, as a practical matter, no recourse. And of course, see, the law enforcement in the United States is counting on that fact, because you see, they figure that if they take, under 10 grand, it's not going to be enough to bother with hiring lawyers and whatnot. It's just going to be like, well, sucks to be you. That's how they've operated the civil asset forfeiture laws in the United States. Okay? But going up to this macro level, see, what are nations and peoples supposed to do when the American government unilaterally and with no judicial review, just as an administrative executive function, decides to take your assets, take your money, and give it to somebody else, or keep it for themselves? And it doesn't matter from your point of view. It's the same thing. You've lost your money. Will you be willing to put your money in the United States or Europe? Of course not. You'd be a fool to. This thing happened on Friday, this announcement. Now, I'm not clear as to how far along they are in this process. My guess is that they're going to be awfully quick about it, to make it slide under the radar. But this is a catastrophe for the United States. Because, like I said, it's estimated, credibly estimated, that over $1 trillion of foreign monies is sitting in the United States. It could be a hell of a lot more. I'm not up on the data. You'd have to look for it yourself. But it's a substantial chunk of change. And so much of this money, especially the big money, when you're going up into the millions and tens of millions and hundreds and billions of dollars, is parked in US Treasury bonds. And this brings us another issue to the Treasury bonds themselves. You see, when you buy a Treasury bond, okay, you buy a specific Treasury bond, see? A specific Treasury bond, because Treasury bonds are fungible, but legally speaking, when you buy a Treasury bond, it has a particular serial number. You're buying that particular Treasury bond. And there are a lot of people outside the United States that have a lot of Treasury bonds for various reasons, and they swap them around and what have you. But the point is, see, what happens if the United States Treasury Department declares that, say, a certain set of serial numbers are no longer valid and they will no longer be honored? Therefore, the Treasury bond becomes worthless on the spot. Now, this might sound crazy, but we're going in that direction. And all of this will scare off finance for the United States. This is a disaster. I mean, I cannot emphasize this enough, okay? Especially as an investor myself, I'm always very careful as to where to park my money so that, nothing happens to it. I want to put it in a safe haven, precisely because, it's in the word, safe haven. I don't want anything to happen to it. But if now the US government is saying that it's going to take your assets merely by virtue of holding a specific passport, then I, for one, would never do that. I'd never put my money in the United States. I'd be a fool to do so. I mean, in fact, I don't put any money in the United States, but for other reasons. But this is just one more reason, right? Just by virtue of me holding a Chilean passport would be justification for me to lose my assets. And potentially they're going to give it to whom? To Peru or Argentina or some shit like that? Fuck that. That is what every Chinese businessman is thinking right now. And so what you're going to start seeing is a huge capital outflow from the United States, principally from the Middle East and China, because they're the ones that have the biggest positions in the United States. You're going to see these huge outflows, and a lot of lawyers in the United States, in New York, and they're going to get a lot of very nervous calls asking, that LLC we set up in Delaware with those nominee directors are like proxy directors, okay? Those nominee directors, are you sure that, there's no way that they can trace that back to me, Mr. Person living in China? Are you absolutely positively sure that it's just your secretary and a few other people there in your office who are the directors, the nominal directors? Oh, you know something? Well, I didn't shut down that LLC and pull that money out and put it someplace safe, like Russia. Because there's something else going on, of course. You see, the Russians, in their fight against their own oligarchs over the last couple of decades, and Vladimir Putin has been very diligent about going after the oligarchs, very sotto-voce kind of thing, but he's been going after them. And you can tell because when you look at the roster of Russian oligarchs back in the year 2000 and compare that list to oligarchs today, they're different people. Okay, so he's been fairly successful, and the Russian government has gone out of its way to be sticklers insofar as any agreement and insofar as property rights are concerned. And so paradoxically, the Chinese might start pulling their money out of the United States and putting it into Russia, of all places. Because at least with the Russians, you know that they're not going to steal your shit. I've gone on almost 20 minutes on this video, but I can't emphasize this enough. It seems trivial. It seems like such a tiny thing, Merrick Garland, is going to take those frozen assets and just outright take them, impound them, and give them to the Ukrainians. It seems like such a trivial thing, but it's huge. It's huge, and those people who are in finance, who are watching me, pay attention to capital outflows over the next 18 months. You're going to see. Understand what's going on.